Let's have a look at my favorite spreadsheet, S&P 500 moving. What this spreadsheet does is it moves a window of a given time length, in this case 35 years, through the S&P 500, calculating how much money you would have made during any given 35-year time frame within the S&P 500. It looks at both the S&P 500 when not reinvesting dividends and when reinvesting dividends. There's very few parts in this in terms of parameters to enter. In this case, we're going to enter 35 for the window length, a $50,000 initial investment, and then we want to have a value for comparison of 2 million. We'll come back to that. Let's look at the plot to see how this looks when using just those two parameters. So click on the plot tab, and we see here is the plot. To read this plot, what you might imagine is, let's say it's 1995. So right here is 1995. And what you had done is you had started investing in 1960. 35 years later, how much money would you have in 1995? Well, starting with $50,000 in 1960, reinvesting your dividends, then 35 years later, 1995, you would have 1.4 million as shown there. So these are the ending dates of the window as plotted here. Now, I encourage you to only look at data in this case from 1970 onwards. We're going to start our assessment from 1935, add 35 years to that, and therefore the window assessment really begins at 1970. In other words, in the book, I explain that 1935 is kind of a break point in the S&P 500. You can read about that. So we're going to look mostly at data that is along the dashed lines where they start and where they end. We're not going to look at the data down and through here. This data is kind of different in terms of how the markets were managed, in particular by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which was created in the 1930s. So let's only really look at this data to get an idea of what our investing lives would be like. Let's go back to the data tab. The reason why I created this spreadsheet, it's my favorite spreadsheet. And the reason why I created it is I had a fundamental question, which is, if I start investing, how long do I have to be invested in order to make some certain amount of money? And of course, it depends upon where you start and stop within the S&P 500. So what I really want to do is look at all starting and stopping points. And that's what this moving window does for this 35-year period. In this case, I was curious, could I make $2 million on a $50,000 investment? How often did that occur? So scroll down here to right here. You see the $2 million here and how often that occurred from 1970 to present, 2024, 2025. The S&P 500 did better than $2 million 42% of the time, 2 million or better. So that's actually kind of encouraging. However, the median value is 1.9 million, and that's less than the average. I'm going to come back to that in a moment when we look at a different distribution of the data. So again, this is the data. We're only going to look along the dashed line. Now, the dashed line, that's our model fit. That's the 10.5% per year that's available to us in the reinvesting of the dividends from 1970 to present. And that's the data that's the best fit line to the S&P 500. Well, clearly it's not the best fit. It's statistically a very simple model. It's an exponential best fit model. But if we added more parameters to it, we would get it to do a better fit. But from our overall general, just simple model, and I really like simple models, we're seeing that a lot of this solid line is above the dashed line. So we're doing better than our expectations. In fact, what we can see is that we're expecting 1.63 million. So we might change this 2 million to 1,628,301. In other words, that's the expectation from the model fit. How often do we do better than that? Almost, 82% of the time. So that's fantastic over a 35-year period. Let's change this up just to have a different view of the data. And I talk all about this throughout the book. So let's have a look at, say, a 20-year window. So any given 20 years, you start in 1935 and in 1955, start in 1936 and in 1956, and so on moving forward. I actually increment it 1 month at a time rather than 1 year at a time because the data comes to us from Robert Shiller, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist, and he created the S&P 500 data, but in a monthly time step. So now we scroll back down and see, oh, none of the time are we doing better than 1.6 million. What's the average? The average is 4.73 or 473,000 from 1955 to present. Remember, we're going to start our assessment 20 years after 1935 because we're using a 20-year window. And now we see that when reinvesting our dividends, we're going to expect to be around $420,000 as a median or $473,000 as an average. That's quite a separation between the median and average. Let's have a look at what that means. But let me first change this to say 450,000 so that we can see how often did we do better than say 450,000. And about 44% of the time we're doing better than 450,000. Let's look at the plot now to see what that distribution looks like. Wow, there's some skew in this data. In other words, there's spikes in the data reaching really up high here and here. Remember, we're only looking at data along during the timeline along the dashed line. So here's a high spike and here's a high spike. That pulls the average up. And so the average, in other words, there's a skew. This data is not exactly normally distributed. Kind of close, but not exactly. But the median will be a better indicator of what our expectations might be. Half the time you're doing better than the median, half the time you're doing worse than the median. That's kind of the definition of the median. So we see there's quite a bit of distribution in this overall data set for a 20-year time period. And it kind of looks like that for the 10-year, 20-year, and even the 30-year data looks like this. These peaks and troughs get washed out in the 35-year data. In any event, I hope that's useful for you to see how to operate this spreadsheet and how to go about reading it. Again, my goal here is not to get you to look at individual dates, but rather to look at the distribution of the data and how does it look, and therefore set your expectations along them.